On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany launched one of the biggest invasions that warfare had ever seen. It opened up the eastern front of the Second World War and saw the German tanks roll into the Soviet Union, with Hitler determined to smash communism, Stalin and the Red Army. Hitler thought it would be a quick victory. However, today we associate Operation Barbarossa with the ultimate failure of the Nazis, with it leading to the downfall of the Third Reich. The failings of Operation Barbarossa saw dozens of thousands of German soldiers freezing to death. However, initially when the invasion began, they were rather successful, taking large amounts of Soviet territory. Initially, the Nazis and Soviets had drawn up a pact as to how to split Poland between the two when the Germans invaded, and inside of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was an agreement for 10 years of peace between the two nations. However, this did not last long. After Hitler defeated France, only Britain was left standing against Germany, so he turned his attention to expanding the German Empire east and towards the Soviet Union. His hope was to repeat the blitzkrieging lightning war of earlier invasions, and with over 3 million German and Axis soldiers, they invaded along an 1,800-mile front. Around 80% of the Wehrmacht were used in the invasion, and Stalin was initially taken by surprise as he refused to believe that Hitler in fact was planning an attack. Barbarossa pitted the Soviet Red Army against the German Wehrmacht and saw some of the most brutal and bloody fighting of the Second World War. It saw millions of soldiers killed, but what didn't help things is that Stalin's government were actually causing harm to their own army. Stalin is remembered as a dictator in which he reigned over with an iron fist and oversaw many bloody purges, but the 1941 Purge of the Red Army actually caused more harm than good to his war effort. So join us today as we look at the brutal executions of Stalin's Red Army Purge, and remember as always to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. When the Second World War broke out, Hitler's plans were to expand his German Empire across Europe, establishing a powerful 1,000-year Reich. Hitler also sought to smash communism and bolshevism, which he saw as evil and backwards, and for this he would have to invade the Soviet Union. However, before the start of the war in 1939, Stalin had carried out a reign of terror over his people in bloody fashion. Between 1936 and 1938, he carried out a large-scale repression of his people, which consisted of killing lots of peasants, ethnically cleansing the population, purging the Communist Party and government officials, and also targeting the Red Army. It was known as the Great Terror, and the aim was to eliminate all dissenting members of the Communist Party, as in anyone who complained about Stalin or simply was suspected of questioning his authority and power. He even went after some of his alleged friends, with the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, organising and conducting many of the executions. Stalin during this time, it's alleged, killed between 950,000 to over 1.1 million of his own people. Inside of the gulags there were also many deaths, but during the Purge he did target the Red Army and the military specifically. The Great Purge removed 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union and 13 of the 15 army commanders, along with 8 of 9 admirals who were all executed. The Navy in particular was greatly affected, and the Red Army's leadership also was hit. 154 out of 186 division commanders were all killed, and all of the army's commissars were killed as well. The severity at the time of the Purge estimated that Stalin had killed up to half of his officers, but today it's accepted that around 5% were killed. Many soldiers were banned from the military and expelled from the Communist Party, being purged from their livelihoods. The effects of this was that Stalin's military was weakened, and at the time he chose to prioritise loyalty over military power. By doing this he ensured that his power was ultimate over the Red Army, and that dissent was not a thing. Many inside of the Red Army were terrified of the knock on the door in the middle of the night that they would be executed, and many even took their own lives for the fear. Over a third of the officers expelled and discharged from the army did successfully appeal their sentences and were reinstated into the Red Army, but the damage had been done to the leadership. Many of the most talented officials and generals inside of the Red Army had been killed and forced out, leaving it a lot weaker than it should have been. Stalin wanted the military to do whatever he wanted, and he also wanted to call the shots. One of the most powerful figures within the Soviet Union was Lavrentiy Beria, a brutal and barbaric man who became the chief of the NKVD, the secret police. Beria was a murderer and a sadist who was responsible for the deaths of thousands. He was responsible for organising purges, including the Katyn massacre, in which 22,000 Polish officers were killed during World War II after the Soviets invaded Poland. He oversaw the gulags, the concentration camp system inside of the Union, and even oversaw the Soviet efforts to make the atom bomb. But from October 1940 to February 1942, the NKVD under Beria's command carried out a new purge that hit the Red Army, especially during the midst of Operation Barbarossa and whilst they were fighting the Second World War. The Red Army had never been in a good state of affairs. Soldiers were rather ill-disciplined, many suffered from alcoholism, and there were excessive shortages of equipment and weapons at the time in World War II. The soldiers were also poorly trained, and the quality of leaders and officers at the time following the Great Purge was not ideal. After the Purge, many officers who had no formal military education had risen at young ages into positions of power, and the Red Army itself tripled in size. In 4 years it had risen from 1.3 million soldiers to, in 1941, 4.5 million. Despite the growth, it was in a poor state, and when Operation Barbarossa was launched, they suffered heavy losses. However, Beria had begun his campaign of terror against the Red Army before. In October 1940, he started a new purge, aimed first to hit the People's Commissariat of Ammunition, the People's Aviation Industry, and the People's Commissariat of Armaments. These industries that made weapons, ammunitions and supplies vital to a war effort and the army were hit very heavily. Beria would drag into interrogation the high officials involved in these industries and bodies, interrogate them and torture them brutally until they confessed guilt that they were involved in treason against Stalin. The NKVD also got these men to testify against others, and they were arrested and executed on charges of sabotage, spying and anti-Soviet activity. This led to an issue inside of these industries, which would be integral to the war. The Air Force was also targeted in 1941, as an inquiry found a high accident rate in the Air Force, which led to many arrests and executions. The head of the Air Force was even executed in this. In May of 1941, a German Ju-52 also landed in Moscow and had been undetected, and this was seen by Stalin and Beria as disgraceful, and there was a huge number of arrests linked to the Air Force. The most senior figures were arrested, interrogated, tortured, and then shot by Beria's men. He believed there must have been a conspiracy to allow the aircraft to land in Moscow, but following the invasion of the Soviet Union, further arrests and executions continued. Initially, when the Germans invaded, they overwhelmed the Red Army's forces on the ground and in the air, and this caused havoc amongst the military's high command. They did not understand the severity of the catastrophe for the Soviet military, and those forces based at the border. The initial stages of Barbarossa were a complete disaster for the Red Army, with very high losses and casualties, and the NKVD and Beria sought to purge to punish. During the early stages of the battles, he executed scores of commanders who were blamed for the failings of the Red Army. All were killed in the same way, mostly by firing squad or by simply being shot. These executions did not help the war effort, leading to weaknesses in the ranks, and also he continued to purge with great severity. Even during the Battle of Moscow, with the fighting erupting around the city, Beria and the NKVD carried out a purge, executing 300 commanders and majors on the 16th of October 1941. More shootings occurred on Beria's orders, including many colonels and generals, and also politicians were targeted. Beria purged the Red Army with ruthless efficiency, and even asked Stalin to make it easier to sentence those inside of the military to death. He was granted extra powers to execute generals and high-up members of the military, and these were then carried out. The hundreds killed were all blamed for the failings to repel the German army, and they were made out as if the blood of the soldiers was on their hands. One example is Pyotr Pumpter, who was a lieutenant general. He had a rich history inside of the military and was even awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union award for his efforts in the Air Force during the Spanish Civil War. However, due to the failings of the Air Force, he was shot by Beria's NKVD. General Ernst Schnacht was also another who was executed by a firing squad on the orders of Beria for the Air Force's failings, and he was also awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union award. These were not just ordinary soldiers purged, it was the elite with rich history within the military. On the day of the Red Army on February the 23rd, 1942, 46 people along with those two just mentioned were dragged out in front of a firing squad and shot. However, what is interesting is that after the Second World War, and after the death of Stalin, it was found that the death sentences and executions of those inside of the Red Army, because of Beria's purge, were unjust. It was found that Beria himself had committed terrorist acts by organising the purge and carrying it out. But how did this affect the war effort during the Second World War for the Soviets? It certainly didn't help matters. 1941 was a disaster year for the Red Army, as the Soviets were battered by the Wehrmacht's quick-moving troops. Millions were taken prisoner, and the Einsatzgruppen followed the German army, executing civilians, including many Soviet Jews and commissars. Hitler ordered all captured enemy soldiers from the Soviet Union to be shot immediately, and many other Soviet POWs were killed after they were captured. The disaster of 1941 was the result of a number of things: the rapid expansion of the armed forces using poorly trained soldiers, a poor lack of leadership, and also the effects of the purges that greatly limited the number of skilled generals and even men on the ground to face Hitler's army. It seemed that Stalin and those generals within government valued loyalty more than military skill, and at the time it was likely that thousands were executed unjustly and unfairly, being forced to admit false charges under torture. The purge and executions of the Red Army were not positive for the war effort, and made things more difficult for Stalin, facing up against the invasion from Hitler. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.